Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about culture in the U.S. following World War II. It's culture in the 1950s. So we're going to start off with talking about World War II veterans. And as veterans from World War II begin to come home, these veterans have to resettle back into their lives and trying to rebuild their lives and really trying to readjust. And so, what the U.S. government does is, in order to help veterans and help the United States, they create what's called the GI Bill of Rights. Basically, it was a way to help veterans return to civilian life. It's going to help pay tuition to colleges. It's going to give a year's worth of unemployment to vets, and it's also going to provide low-interest loans to vets, especially on housing. In the United States following World War II, we did start to see a housing crisis. There just wasn't enough houses out there. We saw this huge shortage of houses. And so there's these guys who come up with this idea that, hey, instead of making every house different and, we make them each special, what if we took this idea of the assembly line, like when we talked about Henry Ford, what if we kind of did something like that with houses? What if we had the exact same concept, the exact same plans, and we just built the same house basically over and over and over again? And that's what started to happen, these mass-produced houses. You might have heard of them called like cookie-cutter houses. This is when you go into a neighborhood and almost every single house looks exactly the same, or maybe there's two different types of houses is all. It makes it for the company building those to do those houses, build them more cost effectively, cheaper, and it also allows them to go up faster. And so we start to see these houses that all look alike during the 1950s. We're also going to start to see suburbs pop up, which are these communities outside of large cities. And that's especially where we're going to start seeing a lot of these mass-produced or these houses that are very quickly built that all kind of look the same. With all of the men returning home from war, we also see where the economy is doing really well after a couple of years after the war in the U.S. We get this huge population boom in the United States. And this generation, these kids who are born following World War II are going to be known as the baby boom generation. And this is because there are so many children who are born. You're going to see this red color right here is the baby boom generation. You'll notice where the number of births was super low, and remember this is during the Great Depression where people weren't wanting to have kids because there wasn't the economy wasn't doing well, and then look, it just skyrockets, and then it begins to drop off again as we go into the 60s and 70s. But there's huge boom right here, is called the baby boom generation, and this would probably be your grandparents, maybe your great grandparents, maybe your parents might be here. So once again, like I was saying, the economy was really going really well. People were having extra money. People were getting paid more in their jobs. And because people had more money, they wanted more goods. They wanted to be able to buy more stuff. They wanted to be able to fill these new houses. And they wanted more services to be provided for them. And so the United States really becomes what they called a consumerism economy. It means lots of people just buying stuff. There are going to be a lot of social problems that follow World War II. We're going to start talking about how when African American veterans return to the United States, especially in the South, they were treated very well in Europe. They had helped save our country. They had helped save, freedom, democracy. And when they returned back to the United States, they returned back to Jim Crow laws. They returned back to segregation. They aren't treated well at all. And what this is going to do is really push the civil rights movement and people realizing that there needs to be change and that African Americans need equality. As we start to see the civil rights movement really beginning to gain momentum, we will see a huge wave of violence happen in the South. Murders, just violence, this huge wave of violence. Um, when Truman comes in, Truman is going to start what's called an anti-lynching law. He's going to abolish the poll tax, and he's also going to end racial discrimination when hiring for federal jobs. The idea is that Truman was going to force through laws desegregation, and he was also going to require that states begin to treat African Americans equally. So we're going to see the government pushing desegregation and equality. Congress will refuse to put these laws into effect, and so Truman will actually begin to make executive orders making these things happen. When we think of the 1950s, a lot of times you'll hear people say, oh, it was the good days, like, look at it. When we talk about the 1950s, really, what we're talking about is something called social conformity. Conformity means that everyone should be the same. Everyone should pretty much dress almost the same, act the same. Like, you didn't want to stand out in the 1950s. And you might be asking yourself, well, why? Why would people not want to stand out? Why would franchises like McDonald's become popular? Well, if we're thinking about, remember that fear of communism, and people are afraid of being a communist, if you stand out and you are different, people might accuse you of being a communist. And so what will happen is, in the United States, people will conform and people will not want to stand out. In fact, companies actually would give you tests, and if you were different, they wouldn't hire you. They didn't want people who could think for themselves. They wanted people who thought the same as everyone else. Luckily, in today's society, we appreciate and we know that there's value in everyone being different. And especially when it comes to work, we need those different ideas. We need those different perspectives. But that wasn't the case in the 1950s. So if you've ever watched like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, you'll hear them talking a lot about conformity and being anti-conformist. This is what they're talking about. It was a push against that 1950s idea of conformity, or everyone being the same. So we can see this in a few ways. One, look at these houses. Once again, those mass-produced houses, they look a lot the same. The cars. Just seeing people trying not to stand out from others. So question, people wanted to look, think, and be the same as everyone else during the 1950s. This is blacklisting or conformity. When everyone wanted to be the same as everyone else and not stand out, is that blacklisting or conformity? As we continue talking about the 1950s and culture in America, we're going to see that there's some major advances in medicine that happen, technology. One of these advances is going to be vaccines. Vaccines really began to come around in the 1950s. Dr. Salk is going to come up with a vaccine for polio. We're going to see vaccines for the smallpox, measles, mumps, rubella, these diseases. And what's going to happen is we're going to see in the United States, in areas where vaccines are distributed, that these diseases that had killed people or had these devastating effects are going to begin to go away. And in fact, smallpox will be eradicated. The only place that you could find it was in laboratories. We're also going to see a lot of new medicines that are put out to fight diseases. So what about women? We've talked about African Americans and how African Americans are going to be pushing for the civil rights movement, which we'll be talking about a little bit. What about women in the 1950s? Remember during World War II that the U.S. government had really had this agenda and had told women, like, you need to get out there, get a job, work, like, you can do this. You can take the job, you can do what men have done. And the U.S. government was pushing these ideas in the 1940s. And what happens is as all of the men begin to return from World War II, the U.S. government is going to change that. And instead, the U.S. government is going to say that women should stay home and they should be mothers and wives. TV shows, magazines, everywhere is going to basically begin to do the opposite propaganda and saying that women should stay at home and that's their job. And so what happens is that some women are completely content with this, but not all women are. And one woman is going to step forward and she's going to write a book. And in this book, she talks about how, while she loves being a mother and a wife, she just doesn't feel satisfied in that role. She wants something else. She wants to have a job also. And this book is called The Feminine Mystique. And what this book is going to do, that is written by Betty Friedan, is it is going to begin the second wave of the women's movement. So question, Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique, which talked about the satisfaction of women as housewives or the dissatisfaction housewives felt in their role. So when we're talking about the 1950s, we're talking about this quote-unquote American dream. Part of this American dream was owning a car. In fact, it was become such a big part of the American dream that they actually call this automania because people went crazy to get cars. The number of people who owned their own car just went through the roof. Cars became a little bit cheaper to buy. Also, it was really easy to get credit. It was cheap credit, so people were out buying cars. It also becomes a status symbol. That means like how you look in the eyes of others. Depending on what kind of car you bought, it would tell others, if you had a good job, if you had money, maybe you just had a lot of credit out there. But it becomes really important to a lot of people to own a car. Practically, because people were beginning to live in suburbs, it also became necessary to have a car. If you wanted to be able to get to school, to get to work, get to church, get to social functions, if you're not living in the city, there's not public transportation, which means you're going to have a car to get to where you want to go. With all of these cars that are coming out, this is also going to lead to traffic problems, and so we're going to see the interstate highway system start. And we just call it the interstate, but the interstate highways begin to be built during this time because there's so many cars. This allows people to get around more effectively. The interstates are going to travel crisscross throughout the United States. It's also going to allow for long-distance truck hauling, people using semi-trucks. People are going to see the advantage in using semis versus railroads. Where railroads, they could only go on the tracks. Now you can transport stuff from anywhere because as long as there's a road. With having all of these cars, you're going to see new types of businesses that come out. You're also going to see tourism go through the roof as people now can take family vacations using their cars. It's easy to get around with these interstate systems. So the car really becomes part of American society. Because the economy is doing so well, we're also going to see advertising grow. It's going to really take off in the 1950s. There's going to be a lot of new products that are out there with technology increasing. We're going to see TVs, we're going to see record players, swimming pools, lawn decorations, like those little flamingos and gnomes and statues and stuff. People put those all over in their yard in the 1950s. We're also going to see the very first credit card come out, the Diners Club card, and that comes out in the 1950s. This will be the beginning of the credit card. It's this age of what they call consumerism. This is where the United States culture becomes enmeshed or really gets into buying things. Just to kind of show you, let's talk about the TV. In 1948, only about 9% of all homes in the United States had a TV. By 1955, that's 7 years, 55% have TVs. By 1960, within 12 years, 90% of all households in the United States had a TV. Advertising takes off. Hello, welcome commercials. And you start to get other products like TV dinners. You're going to start seeing TV shows. So the TV really completely changes American society. Lots of TV shows. A lot of the TV shows in the 50s are going to be comedy shows like I Love Lucy. You're going to also start to see on the scene news reporting, like live from here. We're outside here, Jim, looking at this. It's a change in the news also. We start to see children's programs like the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, the Mouseketeers. Westerns were also huge, shows like Gunsmoke. And when we look at the TV shows that are around in the 50s, we look at the movies that were a lot of westerns and a lot of musicals, it really reinforces this idea of conformity. Because once again, we see these TV shows, these movies, thinking about what is as American as you possibly can get. Remember, people didn't want to stand out or they could get blacklisted. So conformity in all of these things. Next time we're going to talk about the rebellious teenager, which comes about in the 1950s.